Before the Sirens. Germany, 1936. Janifir learned the sound of fear long before she learned its name. At first, it lived quietly behind the radio voices that spoke too loudly of pride and destiny, inside the stiff salutes her teachers demanded each morning, and in the way her father's laughter slowly disappeared from their small apartment in Hamburg. Fear did not scream in those days. It whispered. Janifir was 8 when the red flags began appearing everywhere. They hung from windows like warning signs, their black symbols sharp against the sky. She did not understand politics, but she understood change. Streets that once smelled of bread and coal now smelled of marching boots. Men walked straighter. Women spoke softer. And questions, especially questions, became dangerous. Her father, Heinrich Keller, worked at the docks. He was a quiet man with hands hardened by rope and salt water. He believed in work, not words. When the radio spoke of glory and enemies, he would turn the volume down and say nothing. That silence worried Janifir more than anger ever could. Her mother, Marta, tried to keep life normal. She brushed Janifir's hair every morning, packed her school satchel carefully, and smiled even when food grew scarce. "We endure," she would say. "That is what ordinary people do." Janifir believed her. At school, history had become something sharp and narrow. Teachers no longer spoke of mistakes or suffering, only triumph. Janifir learned which answers were safe and which could get her sent home with a note. She learned to raise her arm when everyone else did, though her stomach twisted each time. At night, she would lie awake and listen to the city breathe, trains clattering, ships groaning in the harbor, radios murmuring through thin walls. Hamburg was alive, but restless, like it knew something terrible was coming and could not escape it. By 1939, Janifir was 11, and the whispers had turned into shouts. War was announced on a warm September morning. Church bells rang, and crowds filled the streets. Some cheered. Others stood still. Janifir stood beside her parents, holding her mother's hand too tightly. "Will it be long?" she asked. Her father looked at the sky, not at her. "Wars never are," he said. And they never are. Soon after, men began leaving. Some proudly, some quietly. Heinrich was called up in early 1940. The night before he left, Janifir pretended to sleep while her parents spoke in low voices. "You don't believe in this," her mother said. "No," Heinrich replied. "But belief doesn't matter anymore." He kissed Janifir's forehead before dawn. She woke to the sound of boots at the door and the smell of cold air. She ran after him down the stairwell, barefoot, but he was already gone. That was the first loss. Letters came at first. Short ones. Careful ones. Heinrich wrote about weather, about routine, about missing home. He never wrote about fear. Janifir read his words until the paper softened, until the ink began to fade. Then the letters slowed. Then they stopped. By 1941, ration cards ruled life. Butter became a memory. Meat a rumor. Marta traded sewing for potatoes and learned how to stretch soup until it was more water than food. Janifir grew thinner, sharper. Childhood peeled away quietly. The first air raid siren sounded one night in 1942. It tore through the city like a wound. Janifir sat up in bed, heart racing, as the sound rose and fell long, mechanical, merciless. Marta burst into the room, already pulling on her coat. "Basement," she said. "Now." The stairwell filled with neighbors, faces pale, children crying. The basement smelled of damp stone and panic. When the bombs fell, they did not sound like explosions at first, more like the sky tearing itself apart. The ground shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. Someone prayed aloud. Janifir pressed her face into her mother's coat and tried to disappear. When they emerged hours later, parts of the street were gone. Buildings stood open, their insides exposed like broken bodies. Fire burned where homes had been. Hamburg had been wounded. After that, sirens became routine. Fear grew teeth. Janifir learned how long she could hold her breath during explosions, how to read the sky for danger, how to run without looking back. In July 1943, the firestorms came. That night, the air felt wrong, heavy, electric. Sirens screamed without pause. The bombs fell closer, faster. Heat followed sound. Sound followed light. The basement doors blew inward. People ran, but the streets were burning. Fire leapt from building to building, swallowing oxygen. Wind screamed through alleys, pulling people toward the flames. Janifir lost her mother's hand. "Mama," she screamed. Smoke blinded her. Heat scorched her skin. She ran because stopping meant dying. She never saw her mother again. When dawn came, Hamburg was ash. Janifir was found near the river, unconscious, burns on her arms, her lungs filled with smoke. A nurse wrote. When dawn came, Hamburg was ash. Janifir was found near the river, unconscious, burns on her arms, her lungs filled with smoke. A nurse wrote her name down wrong. Another corrected it. Janifir Keller. Age 14. Orphan. They sent her east with other children, away from the ruins, away from the bombs. On the train, Janifir stared at her reflection in the window. Her face looked older, harder. Something inside her had closed forever. She did not cry anymore. War had taken her city, her family, and her childhood. And it was only beginning when the sky burned. Eastern Germany, 1943 to 1944. Janifir arrived in the countryside carrying nothing but a thin coat and a silence that felt heavier than luggage. They called it evacuation, but it felt more like exile. Trainloads of children were sent away from burning cities to farms and small villages untouched for now by bombs. The adults said it was for safety. Janifir understood it was because cities had become graves. The village where she was placed lay between fields and forests, far from Hamburg's ruins. Cows moved slowly. The air smelled of earth instead of smoke. It should have felt peaceful. It did not. She was assigned to a farming family, the Bauers. They were not cruel, but they were careful. Food was measured. Words were limited. Emotions were dangerous things in wartime Germany. Frau Bauer gave Janifir chores. Her Bauer avoided her eyes. Their own son had died on the Eastern Front the year before. Janifir was not a replacement, she was a reminder. At night, she dreamed of fire. She woke gasping, heart pounding, convinced the walls were burning. But the walls stood. The ceiling was intact. Still, she could not sleep again. School resumed in the village, though it felt hollow. Teachers repeated slogans like prayers. Janifir recited them without thinking. She had learned that survival required obedience. Letters from soldiers were read aloud in class. Names of the dead followed. Each announcement landed like a stone dropped into water, ripples of grief, then silence. Janifir never heard her father's name. By 1944, the war had turned. Everyone knew it, even if no one said it aloud. Supplies shrank. Radios spoke faster, louder, angrier. Boys younger than Janifir were being trained with wooden rifles. Old men were issued uniforms that did not fit. Janifir was 15 when the Allied planes began appearing even over the countryside. The sky no longer belonged to God. It belonged to machines. One afternoon, she was in the fields when the planes passed overhead, dark shapes moving with purpose. She froze, sick with recognition. The sound dragged her back to Hamburg, to screaming wind and firestorms. She dropped to the ground and covered her head, shaking. When the planes passed, nothing had fallen. But the fear stayed. That evening, a group of refugees arrived in the village, thin, hollow-eyed, carrying stories no one wanted to hear. They spoke of cities flattened, of armies retreating, of chaos spreading like a disease. Janifir listened from the doorway. One woman mentioned Hamburg. "It's gone," she said simply. Janifir felt something break, not loudly, but completely. Later that night, she cried for the first time since the firestorm. Silent tears soaked her pillow as she mourned not just her family, but the version of herself that had once believed the world could be safe. In early 1945, orders came. The Volkssturm. Every able body was to serve. Boys. Old men. Anyone who could hold a weapon. Janifir watched as the village gathered in the square. Fear was no longer hidden. It stood openly on faces, raw and undeniable. Her Bauer was given a rifle older than he was. Frau Bauer stood straight, jaw tight, saying nothing. Janifir understood then. The war was no longer somewhere else. It had arrived. That night, she packed quietly. A loaf of bread. A scarf. The coat. She did not know where she was going, only that staying meant waiting to be buried under someone else's decisions. She left before dawn. The roads were full of people moving in all directions, like ants after their nest had been destroyed. Some fled west, some east. No one knew where safety was anymore. Janifir walked with a group of women and children at first. Then alone. She saw things she would never forget. Villages emptied overnight. Horses dead in ditches. Burned-out vehicles littering roadsides like bones. Soldiers wandering without units, eyes vacant. Once, she passed a line of prisoners guarded by armed men. They were thin beyond recognition. Their striped clothes hung loose. Their faces held a kind of suffering Janifir did not yet have words for. She looked away, ashamed of her relief that she was not one of them. Near a ruined town, she was caught in artillery fire. She dove into a cellar with strangers, Russians advancing, Germans retreating, shells falling without mercy. A woman beside her was hit. Blood soaked the dirt floor. Janifir pressed her hands against the wound, though she had no idea what she was doing. "Don't let me die alone," the woman whispered. Janifir stayed until the breathing stopped. Afterward, she could not feel her hands. When the fighting moved on, Janifir emerged into silence broken only by distant gunfire. She stood among ruins again, déjà vu wrapping around her like a curse. She wondered how many times a person could lose everything and still remain human. Weeks later, the war ended. Not with celebration, but exhaustion. Germany lay broken. Cities flattened. Millions dead. Flags changed, but suffering did not vanish with them. Janifir was 17 when she stood in the rubble of what had once been a town and realized she had survived. Survived fire. Bombs. Hunger. Loss. But survival, she learned, was not victory. It was responsibility. She did not know yet what she would do with it, but the silence after the guns felt heavier than the noise of war ever had. And somewhere deep inside, something began to stir, not hope, not yet, but resolve, after the silence. Germany, 1945 to 1952. The war did not end in a moment. It ended in fragments. For Janifir, it ended on a gray morning when the guns stopped and the silence felt wrong, too wide, too empty, like the pause after a scream. No bells rang. No crowds cheered. People simply stood where they were and waited, unsure what came next. She was 17 and alone. The land around her was scarred beyond recognition. Roads had become lines of rubble. Houses stood roofless, walls split open, private lives exposed to the sky. The smell of smoke lingered even where nothing burned anymore. Janifir walked west with no destination, only instinct. She avoided soldiers when she could. German, Allied, it made no difference. War had stripped uniforms of meaning. Power still existed, and so did fear. Food was survival now. She learned which fields still produced potatoes, which farms might trade work for soup. She learned how to read faces quickly, who might help, who might take advantage. One evening, near the remains of a small town, she collapsed from exhaustion. When she woke, she was indoors. A woman sat beside the bed, old but steady-eyed. Her hair was tied back, her sleeves rolled up. The room smelled of boiled vegetables and soap. "You're safe," the woman said in careful German. For now. Her name was Elizabeth Voigt, a former schoolteacher who had lost her husband and both sons to the war. She had turned her partially standing house into a shelter for girls, orphans, refugees, the unwanted remnants of a destroyed nation. Janifir stayed. At first, she spoke little. Trauma had made words feel unnecessary, even dangerous. She helped clean, carried water, repaired what could be repaired. At night, the girls slept side by side on the floor, comforted by shared breathing. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they didn't. Elizabeth did not push. She understood silence. One winter evening, as snow fell softly outside, Elizabeth asked Janifir a question she had avoided for months. "What do you want to become?" Janifir stared at the wall. For years, her only goal had been to survive the next day. "I don't know," she said finally. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "That's honest," Elizabeth replied. "It's also dangerous. Empty futures get filled by other people." That night, Janifir dreamed not of fire, but of rubble slowly turning into streets again. In 1946, occupation changed everything. New flags, new rules, new guilt. The truth began to surface, not whispered anymore, but spoken aloud in courtrooms and newspapers. Camps, mass graves, crimes too large to understand all at once. Janifir listened. Each revelation felt like a weight pressing on her chest. She had not committed these acts, but she had lived under the same sky. She had survived while millions had not. Survivor's guilt found her then. "I didn't know," she said once, her voice breaking. Elizabeth looked at her carefully. "Many didn't. But ignorance doesn't erase responsibility. It defines what you do next." Janifir began helping Allied aid workers as a translator. Her English was rough but improving. She escorted displaced families, helped register missing persons, listened to stories that made her own pain feel smaller and somehow heavier. One day, she found her father's name. Not on a list of survivors. Not on a list of heroes. On a casualty report from the Eastern Front. 1942. She sat with the paper in her hands for hours. Then she folded it carefully and placed it under a stone by the river. "I remember you," she whispered. "Even if the world doesn't." Years passed. Germany rebuilt itself slowly, painfully, brick by brick. Janifir grew into adulthood among ruins and questions. She studied when she could, learned when books were scarce, listened more than she spoke. She chose education. Not because she loved it, but because she believed ignorance had been one of the war's most powerful weapons. By 1950, she was teaching children in a temporary schoolhouse. The walls were thin, the desks mismatched, but the children laughed. They asked questions. She encouraged that. One afternoon, a student asked her, "Why do people fight wars?" The room went quiet. Janifir paused, choosing honesty over comfort. "Because they forget," she said. "They forget that the people on the other side are human. And because some are taught not to ask questions." The child nodded, satisfied. Janifir was not. That evening, she walked through the rebuilt streets, past shops and trams and people trying to live normally again. The city looked healed, but she knew how fragile it was. She stopped at a memorial stone bearing thousands of names. She touched the cold surface. "I lived," she said softly. "I will make it mean something." In 1952, Janifir stood before a class of students, boys and girls born after the war, untouched by sirens and firestorms. She taught them history. Not the glorious version. The real one. She spoke of ordinary people. Of silence. Of fear. Of choices made and choices avoided. She did not spare them discomfort, but she gave them truth. Sometimes, when she walked home at dusk, she still flinched at sudden noises. Some wounds never fully healed. But she no longer ran. Janifir Keller, once a child of fire and rubble, had become a keeper of memory. The war had taken her family, her city, her innocence. It had not taken her voice. And as long as she spoke, as long as someone listened, the silence that followed the war would never be empty again.